On a dry field in the northern reach, 3 dragons took to the sky at once, and 4,000 men burned alive in a single afternoon. It was the only time in all of Aegon's conquest that Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes fought together. The grass caught. The wind carried the flames into the ranks of the largest army Westeros had ever assembled, and by dusk, that army no longer existed. That field was called the Field of Fire, and the swords of the men who died there were carried downriver and melted into a throne. Westeros was made and unmade on its battlefields. 6 of them stand above all the rest, separated by centuries, but bound by the same ground and the same crown. Each decided who would rule, and not one was won by numbers. Every one was won by a single terrible advantage the losers never saw coming. This is the story of the greatest battles of Westeros, and of the throne of melted swords that every one of them was fought to win. Before there was a throne, there was a man with 3 dragons and almost nothing else. When Aegon Targaryen came ashore at the mouth of the Blackwater, he brought fewer than 1,600 men. That was the whole of his army. Against the 7 kingdoms of Westeros, each with its own king, its own castles, its own tens of thousands of swords, it was nothing. On paper, the conquest should have failed on the first day. Any one of the kings he meant to unseat could have raised 10 times his numbers without emptying his own lands. But Aegon did not count on numbers. He counted on his dragons and on fear. He raised his wooden fort on the tallest of the 3 hills above the river and settled in. Then he began to move against the lords nearest the bay, and he learned quickly which of them would kneel and which would fight. The lords of Rosby and Stokeworth looked at the shapes wheeling above the Blackwater and chose to live. They bent the knee without a battle. Others tried to resist. The rulers of Duskendale and Maidenpool, House Darklyn and House Mooten, marched out to throw the invaders back into the sea, and they were beaten. In the aftermath, the young heir of Maidenpool, Jon Mooten, saw where the future lay. He abandoned the losing side and swore himself to Aegon, and the Dragon King rewarded him for it. That single choice would matter more than anyone could have guessed, because Aegon would soon place an army in his hands. 2 acts of the early conquest taught Westeros what these dragons truly meant, and both involved castles that men had believed unbreakable. The first was Harrenhal. It was the greatest stronghold ever raised in the 7 kingdoms, a monstrous pile of stone on the shore of the God's Eye, built by Harren the Black to be beyond the reach of any enemy. Its walls were so thick and so high that Harren believed no army could ever take it. He was right. No army ever did. But Aegon did not bring an army to Harrenhal. He brought Balerion, the Black Dread, the largest dragon the world had ever seen, and he flew over those impossible walls and turned the towers into furnaces. Harren and all his sons burned inside the castle they had thought would keep them safe. The stone did not save them. It cooked them. From that night, House Hoare was finished, and every lord in Westeros understood that thick walls were no longer a shield. They could become an oven. The second lesson came in the south, against the Storm King. Argilac Durendon, last of his ancient line, met Aegon's forces in the field, and in a battle men afterward called the Last Storm, the Storm Lords were broken and their king was killed. His line ended with him. The great houses of the Stormlands passed into Aegon's peace. By now the pattern was plain, and it was terrifying. Aegon had taken the strongest castle in the realm without a siege. He had destroyed an ancient kingdom in a single fight. Kings were kneeling. Those who did not kneel were dying. But there was one thing Aegon had not yet done, and the sharper minds in Westeros noticed it. He had not yet faced a true army in the open field, a great host of tens of thousands, arrayed for open battle on ground of its own choosing. Walls had failed against dragons. Whether flesh and numbers might succeed where stone had not was still, for the moment, an open question. 2 kings decided to answer it. In the west, Loren I of House Lannister ruled from Casterly Rock, master of the gold-rich Westerlands. In the south, Mern of House Gardner ruled the Reach from Highgarden. The Reach was the richest and most populous land in all of Westeros. Endless fields, endless granaries, and more men than any other realm could put in the field. Apart, either king commanded a formidable strength. Together, they meant to be unstoppable. They joined their armies at Golden Grove, the seat of House Rowan, and the host they assembled was the largest ever seen in Westeros to that day. 55,000 men marched under their banners. 5,000 of them were mounted knights, of the kind that had shattered lesser armies for centuries. Against Aegon's 1,600, it was more than 30 times the number. It outmatched him 5-1, even counting every man the Dragon King could scrape together from his conquered lands. And the flower of the Reach marched with Mern. The great houses of the south rode under the green hand of the gardeners. Oakhart and Florent, Rowan and Peak, and Redwine of the Arbour. With them came the Order of the Green Hand, the proud sworn knights of House Gardner, the finest chivalry the Reach could boast. It was a magnificent army, gathered from the wealthiest kingdom in the world, led by 2 crowned kings who had never known defeat. One great strength stayed home, and its absence would echo for centuries. Lord Manfred Hightower of Oldtown, one of the most powerful bannermen in all the Reach, did not march. The High Septon, the voice of the faith, counselled against the war, and Lord Hightower heeded him. He kept the strength of Oldtown behind its walls. Had those men marched with Mern, the host would have been larger still, but they did not, and so the greatest city of the south sat out the battle that would decide the fate of the realm. Against this, Aegon could set almost nothing of equal quality. His own 1,600 were the hard core of his force, but the bulk of the men he could field were levies drawn from the lands he had just conquered. These were Riverlanders, many of them freshly delivered from generations of cruel iron-born rule under the Whores. They were not seasoned soldiers of a great kingdom. They were farmers and fishermen with spears, grateful to be free and wholly untested against armoured knights. And command of this army Aegon gave to Jon Mooton, the very lord who had abandoned Maidenpool to join him. It was a host outnumbered many times over, made of conscripts, led by a recent turncoat. The 2 kings looked at all of this and saw a foregone conclusion. They had the numbers, they had the knights, they had the wealth of 2 kingdoms and the pride of 1,000 years. 3 dragons had burned castles and beaten small forces, and broken a Storm King in a scramble, yes. But no beast, however large, could burn its way through 55,000 men. Somewhere in that great host, there would be arrows enough, spears enough, sheer bodies enough, to bring the monsters down. That was the calculation. Drown the dragons in men. It was the accumulated wisdom of every war ever fought in Westeros, where numbers had always mattered more than anything else. The largest army had always won. The 2 kings simply believed what every commander before them had believed. By the time they marched, Aegon had already taught the realm one lesson beyond dispute. Walls meant nothing to him. Harrenhal had proved it, and every lord who had knelt without a fight had proved it again. The only question left in all of Westeros was whether an open host, vast enough and brave enough, could succeed where stone had failed. 55,000 men were marching north to answer that question, and every one of them believed the answer was already written in their numbers. They were about to be the first to learn how wrong that belief was. The two hosts came together on the open plain south of the Blackwater Rush, near the road that ran west toward the Lannister lands. It was flat, dry country, good ground for horse, the kind of field where a great army could spread its full weight and use every man it had. The two kings had chosen well. On ground like this, 5,000 knights could ride down anything in their path, and 55,000 men could simply fold their smaller enemy into pieces. Aegon's army was outnumbered so badly that a straight fight was unthinkable. His commander, Jon Mooton, did what a man must do when he cannot match his enemy's numbers. He drew his conscripts into a defensive crescent, a great curved line meant to hold and absorb, and he waited. There would be no bold advance. The Riverlanders would stand, and they would try to survive the charge that was coming. The plan of the two kings was simple and sound. They would use their vast numbers to overlap the smaller host on both flanks, and they would send their armored knights thundering into the center to break it. It was the oldest and most reliable battle plan in Westeros, and against any ordinary foe it would have worked. 55,000 against a few thousand levies had only one likely ending. The Allied charge began, and at first it went exactly as the kings had intended. The mounted knights of the Reach and the West drove into the Targaryen line, and the conscript spearmen, brave as they were, could not hold armored horse for long. The crescent bent. The spear lines began to break under the weight of the charge, and the great host pressed forward, sensing the kill, closing in from the flanks to finish what the knights had begun. In those first moments, on the ground, the battle was going precisely the way numbers said it should. The largest army in the history of Westeros was about to swallow the little host in front of it. Then Aegon and his sisters took to the sky. Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes rose together from behind the Targaryen lines, and for the only time in the whole conquest, all three dragons flew to war at once. Aegon rode the Black Dread, the largest of them. Visenya rode Vhagar, and Rhaenys rode Meraxes, and the three of them climbed into the air above the plain and turned toward the great host below. They did not strike at the knights or the center or any single point of the enemy line. They struck at the field itself. The ground was dry, the grass high and dead, the day warm. The dragons swept low over the plain and let their fire fall across it, and the whole field caught. Flame ran through the dry grass faster than a man could ride, and it did not run in one place but everywhere the dragons passed. The sisters set the fires with care, choosing the upwind edge of the enemy host, so that the wind itself became a weapon and drove the wall of fire straight into the packed ranks of the two kings. The very numbers that were meant to drown the dragons now became a trap. 55,000 men were crowded together on open ground, with fire sweeping toward them and no room to run. What followed was a burning. 4,000 men died in the flames on that field, burned alive where they stood, unable to break free of the press of their own army. 1,000 more fell to sword and spear in the chaos, cut down as the lines dissolved and men trampled one another trying to escape. 10,000 others were burned and lived, carrying the marks of that day for the rest of their lives. The field itself gave the battle its name ever after. Men called it the Field of Fire, and the ground was black and smoking long after the dragons had climbed away. The great houses of the Reach were shattered in a single afternoon. King Mern, the ninth of a house gardener, died on that field, and so did every male of his line who had ridden to war with him. Sons, grandsons, brothers, cousins, nephews, all of them consumed. 1,000 years of Gardener Kings ended in the fire. The Order of the Green Hand, the proud sworn knights who had ridden out as the finest chivalry of the South, was wiped from the world. Lord Armand Peake burned, and his sons with him. The magnificent host that had assembled at Golden Grove, gathered from the richest kingdom in Westeros and led by 2 crown kings, came apart in a few hours of flame and panic. One king lived. Loren of House Lannister, King of the Rock, saw that the day was lost and did not stay to die for it. He rode straight through a gap in the flames, through the smoke and the fire, and came out the other side alive. He fled the field with what men he could gather, leaving the Reach to burn behind him. His survival would matter, because a living king could kneel, and a kneeling king could keep his lands. Against the 4,000 burned and the thousands more dead and maimed, Aegon's losses can be counted almost on nothing. Fewer than 100 of his men died on the field of fire. The conscripts, who had been breaking under the charge only moments before, now stood on a field of ash and looked at what their king's dragons had done. The only wound that touched the Targaryens themselves was to Visenya, who took an arrow in the shoulder from the ground as Vhagar swept low over the enemy. She kept her seat and kept flying. That arrow was the whole of the price the dragons paid for destroying the largest army the 7 kingdoms had ever raised. The meaning of that day reached far beyond the men who died on it. For 1,000 years, war in Westeros had followed one rule above all others, and every lord and king had built his hopes on it. The largest army won. Numbers decided battles. A commander who could put more men in the field than his enemy held the advantage before a single sword was drawn. And the 2 kings had marched to the Blackwater carrying that certainty like a shield. They had assembled numbers no one had ever matched, and they had lost anyway. Burned to ash while their enemy lost fewer men than a village holds. This was the moment the age of ordinary armies ended. After the field of fire, no host in Westeros, however vast or well led, could stand against dragons on open ground. The old arithmetic of war was dead. 55,000 men had proven it by dying, and every lord still living in the 7 kingdoms understood the lesson at once. Walls had already failed against dragons at Harrenhal. Now open numbers had failed on the Blackwater plains. There was nothing left to try. Stone could not stop them, and men could not stop them, and that meant nothing could. The other kings of Westeros were still on their thrones when the smoke cleared, but the news of the field of fire was already spreading north and west, carried by fleeing survivors and frightened riders, and it carried a single message that could not be argued with. Aegon Targaryen could not be beaten. Whatever a king might do, whatever host he might raise or castle he might hold, in the end, there was only the choice between kneeling and burning. The field where the 2 kings had marched to save Westeros became instead the place where the last real resistance to the dragons died, and the swords of the men who had fallen there were about to be gathered up and carried downriver, to be turned into something no king in Westeros would ever forget. There was one thread of the Gardner line still left unburned when the fires died. A nephew of King Mern had survived the field, pulled from the smoke alive, and for 3 days it seemed that some small remnant of the oldest royal house in the Reach might endure. But his burns were too deep, and on the 3rd day he died of them. With his last breath, 1,000 years of Gardner Kings came to an end. There was no son, no brother, no cousin left to raise the crown of the kings of the Reach. The line that had ruled Highgarden since the age of heroes was simply gone, wiped out in a single afternoon. Loren of House Lannister made a different choice, and it saved him. The King of the Rock, with his army broken and the Reach in ashes, understood what the fire had taught. He came before Aegon and laid down his crown. He bent the knee, swore his sword and his house to the Targaryen king, and in return Aegon let him rise as a lord, rather than fall as a corpse. Loren kept Casterly Rock and all its wealth, and he was named Warden of the West, the king's man in the lands he had once ruled as a king himself. He would be remembered as Loren the last king of the Rock, but he lived, and his house lived with him. A crown was a small thing to trade for that. Then Aegon did something that no conqueror before him had thought to do, and it turned a battlefield into a symbol that would outlast every man who fought on it. He ordered the swords of the fallen gathered up from the field of fire. Blades by the thousand, the arms of the dead knights and lords and levies who had marched with the two kings, were collected from the ash and the mud and carried down the Blackwater rush to the mouth of the river, to the rough timber fort Aegon had raised when he first landed. There the swords waited for the fire again, but a different fire this time. Aegon meant to forge them into a throne. He wanted a seat made from the weapons of his enemies, blades taken from men who had tried to kill him and failed, twisted and beaten together by dragon flame into a single monstrous chair. It would take years to make, and it would come out jagged and cruel, a thing of barbs and points that no king could sit in comfort. That was the whole meaning of it. Aegon believed a king should never sit easy. The Iron Throne would be built from the surrender of the Reach and the West, from the swords of the largest army Westeros had ever raised and lost. Every king who came after would rule from the melted proof of what dragons had done on the Blackwater plains. With the two kings destroyed, Aegon rode for Highgarden itself, the seat of the gardeners, and found it open to him. There was no king left to defend it, and no army left to try. The castle was held only by its household, and its household was led by a steward named Harlan Tyrell. He was a man who had served the gardeners all his life, and now had no gardener left to serve. Harlan opened the gates and yielded the castle without a fight. It was the only sensible thing to do, and Aegon rewarded it richly. He raised Harlan Tyrell higher than any steward had ever dreamed of rising. He made him Lord of Highgarden, gave him the great castle and all its lands, named him Lord Paramount of the Mander and Warden of the South. In a single stroke, a man who had spent his life managing another family's household became one of the most powerful lords in Westeros, master of the richest and most fertile kingdom in the Seven Kingdoms. The Tyrells had never been kings. They had never even been a great house. Now they ruled the whole of the Reach in the king's name. The old noble houses of the Reach never forgave it. Oakhart, Floren, Rowan, Peak, Redwine. Proud lines, ancient lines, some of them with far better blood claims to Highgarden than a steward could ever hope to have. They had marched with King Mern, and those who survived came home to find themselves kneeling to the man who had once counted their king's silver. To them, the Tyrells were up-jumped stewards, servants raised above their betters by a foreign conqueror who did not know or care about the old order of the Reach. That resentment did not die with the men who first felt it. It settled into the ground of the Reach and stayed there, passed down through the generations, a quiet bitterness that would still be alive centuries later. Far to the north, one great king remained who had not yet faced Aegon. Torrhen Stark, king in the north, gathered his strength and marched south to meet the dragons in the field. He crossed the neck with 30,000 Northmen at his back, a hard and proud host from the coldest kingdom in Westeros, and he came down into the riverlands ready to give battle. But on the way south, the news reached him. He heard what had happened at Harrenhal, where the greatest castle ever built had become a tomb for the man who raised it. He heard what had happened on the Field of Fire, where 55,000 men and 2 crowned kings had burned in an afternoon. Torrhen brought his army to the banks of the Trident and made his camp within sight of Aegon's host across the water, and there he stopped to think. He was no coward, and 30,000 Northmen were nothing to throw away lightly. But he had heard the same lesson every other king had heard, and he was wise enough to believe it before it was proven on his own men. He could cross the river and give battle and watch his people burn as the gardeners had burned, or he could bend the knee and keep them alive. He spent a long, cold night weighing his crown against his kingdom. In the end, Torrhen Stark chose his people over his pride. He crossed the Trident, laid his crown at Aegon's feet, and swore his oath. He would be remembered as the king who knelt, and some in the north would always think less of him for it. But he brought 30,000 men home alive, who would otherwise have died for nothing, and he kept the north whole under a Stark. Like Loren before him, he had learned to read the only choice the dragons left standing. That was the true harvest of the Field of Fire. The battle had not merely won Aegon a war, it had built the very throne the war was fought for, forged from the swords of the men who died resisting him. And it had taught every king still living in Westeros the one lesson that mattered. Against dragons, there was no fighting, no holding, no cleverness that could save a man. There was only kneeling, and kneeling was survival. One by one, the crowns of the old kingdoms came down. Their kings had seen what waited for those who stood against the dragons, and they knelt rather than learn it firsthand. That lesson held for 100 years. The kings of the old kingdoms stayed kneeling, and the house that had taught them to kneel ruled without a rival. Aegon died in his bed, and his sons ruled after him, and their sons after them. The crown passed down the Targaryen line from father to child, and with it passed the dragons. What had been 3 beasts on the Field of Fire became a whole brood in the years of peace. They were bred on Dragonstone and raised in the great domed dragon pit of King's Landing, until the Targaryens kept more dragons than they could ride. Every prince and princess of the blood grew up expecting to ride one. That was the strength no other house could match. A family with dragons did not need to be loved, or even obeyed, so long as it was feared, and for 3 generations it was enough. The peace reached its height under King Viserys I, a mild and generous man who wanted nothing so much as calm. His reign was long and rich, and it should have ended quietly. Instead, it ended in the worst way a Targaryen reign could end, with 2 claimants and 2 crowns, and dragons enough to burn the realm to the ground, fighting over which of them was true. The trouble was a promise Viserys had made and never unmade. He had named his daughter Rhaenyra his heir, and made his lord swear to uphold her. But he had also taken a second wife and fathered sons, and those sons grew up in the same court, watching a woman stand between them and the throne they believed was theirs by right. When Viserys died, the 2 halves of his family did not wait to see which way the realm would lean. Rhaenyra's faction, the Blacks, held Dragonstone, the ancient Targaryen island seat at the mouth of Blackwater Bay. Her half-brother Aegon's faction, the Greens, held King's Landing and the Iron Throne itself, and crowned him Aegon II before Rhaenyra even knew her father was dead. 2 courts, 2 crowns, 1 dynasty. The war that followed would be remembered as the Dance of the Dragons, and its name was a bitter joke, because there was nothing graceful in it. For the first time since Valyria fell, dragon met dragon in the sky. The weapon that had made the Targaryens untouchable was turned inward, against their own kin, and both sides had it. The killing began fast, and it began personal. Early in the war, one of Rhaenyra's young sons flew to Storm's End on a small dragon and met his uncle there, a fierce green prince riding a monster far older and larger than his own. The boy and his dragon did not come home. That single death, a child pulled screaming from the sky, turned a cold quarrel into open slaughter. After it, neither side would speak of mercy. Uncles hunted nephews, cousins burned cousins, and the count of dead dragons began to climb. Something no one in Westeros had ever imagined could happen at all. At first, the dance was fought, where every Westerosi war was fought, on the land and in the sky above it. But the Blacks held the islands at the mouth of Blackwater Bay, and islands live or die by the sea. Dragonstone and Driftmark could not feed themselves without ships, could not move armies without ships, could not stay in the war without the sea lanes open beneath them. And there the Blacks held a great advantage, for the sea power of Rhaenyra's cause was the fleet of House Velaryon. The Velaryons of Driftmark were the greatest sailors in Westeros, and their lord, Corlys Velaryon, was called the Sea Snake for the voyages that had made him the richest man in the 7 kingdoms. His ships numbered in the hundreds, and with them the Blacks ruled the waters around their own islands and choked the trade that fed King's Landing. So long as the Velaryon fleet held the narrow sea, Rhaenyra's strongholds were safe, and her enemy's capital went hungry. The Greens could not match that fleet with ships of their own, so they bought one. Across the narrow sea lay the free cities, and 3 of them, Lys, Myr, and Tyrosh, had bound themselves together into an alliance the Westerosi called the Triarchy, or simply the 3 Daughters. The Triarchy lived by trade and by plunder, and a war between 2 branches of the same rich family was exactly the sort of thing it existed to profit from. For the right promises, its admirals agreed to sail against the Blacks. A great fleet was gathered in the east, near 100 war galleys crewed by hardened fighting men, and it set its course for the waters at the heart of Rhaenyra's power. Those waters had a name. The Gullet was the channel where the sea narrowed between Dragonstone, Driftmark, and the mouth of Blackwater Bay, the throat through which every ship bound for King's Landing or the Black Islands had to pass. Whoever held the Gullet held the door to half the war. The Triarchy meant to smash the Velaryon fleet there, break the blockade, reopen the sea for the Greens, and hunt down the Black-held islands one by one. It was the natural place for the 2 sea powers to meet, and both of them knew it. But the Gullet held more than warships that season. Even as the fleets circled toward one another, a small convoy was making ready to sail out through the same channel, and it carried the most precious cargo the Blacks possessed. The dance had already taught Rhaenyra how easily a Targaryen child could die. She had lost 1 son from the back of a dragon, and she was not willing to gamble the rest. So she chose to send her 2 youngest boys away across the narrow sea, out of the war entirely, to be kept safe among friends in the free cities until the killing was done. They were only children, the smaller of them no more than a boy of 7, and they were sent under escort of the Velaryon ships, sailing out through the Gullet toward the open water beyond. The elder of the 2 boys did not go unarmed, in a manner of speaking. He was old enough to have claimed a young dragon of his own, and it went with him, small and half-grown, but a dragon all the same. And he wasn't the only dragon rider in those waters. The Blacks had begun to run short of the true-born Targaryens needed to ride their unclaimed beasts, and out of desperation, they had started binding dragons to riders of humbler blood, bastards and small folk with a drop of the old Valyrian line in them, men who came to be called dragon seeds. New and untested as they were, they and their mounts were still dragons in the sky, and a handful of them would be near the Gullet when the Triarchy came. That was the whole of it, laid out in the narrow water. On one side, 100 galleys full of foreign fighting men, sent by cities that had no love for either Targaryen faction, and wanted only to be paid in the wreckage. On the other, the Velaryon fleet, the greatest in Westeros, guarding a convoy that carried the future of Rhaenyra's line. And above them all, only a scattering of dragons, one ridden by a boy fleeing the war, the rest by riders who had been small folk a season before. 100 years earlier, 3 dragons had risen over a dry field and ended the age of ordinary armies in a single afternoon. Now the same beasts had turned on one another, and a foreign fleet had come to grow fat on the sight of Targaryens killing Targaryens. Between 100 ships and the Queen's own blood stood nothing but a few dragons and the men who held the sea. The channel waited, and the fleets closed upon it, and the Gullet was about to become one of the bloodiest stretches of water in the history of Westeros. The Triarchy struck first, and it struck the convoy. The ASOIAF captains had come for plunder, but they had also been paid to hurt the Blacks. And there was no richer target in all that water than a huddle of ships flying Valyrian colours around a fat, slow cog. The war galleys of Lys, Myr, and Tyrosh drove in among the escort with their oars beating like the legs of some vast insect. And the fighting that followed was the worst kind there is at sea. Close, blind, and without any hope of retreat. Rams splintered hulls. Grappling lines bit into railings and would not let go. Men crossed from deck to deck with axes and short blades, and the water between the ships filled with the drowning and the dead. The Velaryons gave better than they got, ship for ship, for they were the finest sailors in the world, and they were fighting for the blood of their own queen. But there were too many galleys. The escort was 7 strong against a fleet, and slowly, deck by deck, the smaller force was being ground down. The cog carrying the 2 young princes was a plump, helpless thing in the middle of it, and every Triarchy captain in the channel knew what was aboard her. Word of the ambush raced back across the water to Dragonstone, and the dragons rose. At their head flew Prince Jacaerys, the Queen's eldest living son, and the heir to her cause. He was young, barely more than a boy himself, but he was a dragon rider of true Targaryen blood, mounted on Vermax, and when he saw the Gullet below him churning with foreign galleys around his little brother's ship, he did not hesitate. He took Vermax down into the fight. For a while, it was the old story told again, the story of the field of fire carried onto the sea. Dragon flame poured down out of the sky, and where it touched, the galleys came apart. Pitch and tar and oiled timber went up in an instant. Whole crews leapt into the water rather than cook on their own decks, and the water was scarcely kinder, for it was choked with wreckage and fouled with fire. A single pass of a dragon could turn a proud war galley into a floating pyre. For a time, it seemed the dragons alone might sweep the channel clean. But 100 years had taught Westeros something the Field of Fire had not. A dragon in the open sky, high above a burning host, is a god. A dragon low over a crowded deck, close enough to breathe on the men below, is a target. And the Triarchy had come ready. Their galleys bristled with scorpions and crossbows, and their decks were crowded with archers who had been told exactly what they were sailing against. As the dragons swept down to burn, the ships answered with iron. Bolts and arrows filled the air over the Gullet in dark clouds, thousands of them, and they did not need to find a rider to matter. Enough of them in enough hide would bring any beast down. This was the lesson of the whole dance in miniature. The weapon that could not be beaten in the sky could still be dragged out of it, if enough ordinary men were willing to stand and loose while it came for them. Vermax was brought down over the water. The accounts of exactly how it happened do not agree, as accounts of such moments seldom do. Some say the dragon was struck by a storm of bolts and fell into the sea. Some say he flew too low over a burning ship, and something went wrong. That beast and rider came down together into the churning channel. What is certain is the end of it. Prince Jacaerys Velaryon, heir to the Iron Throne of his mother's claim, went into the Gullet and did not come out. When a dragon falls among enemies, the men who put it there do not show mercy, and they did not show it to him. He died in the water, within sight of the brothers he had flown to save. It was the death that made the Gullet infamous. Rhaenyra had already lost one son to a dragon's teeth over Storm's End. Now she lost another, and this one was her heir, the boy who would have worn her crown. In a single afternoon on the water, the Blacks lost the future of their line. The convoy he had come to save fared little better. The elder of the two young princes, mounted on his own half-grown dragon, threw the beast into the fight beside his brother and the Velaryon ships, small as it was against galleys and archers. The dragon took wound after wound in that press, bolts and arrows lodging in its hide until it could barely stay aloft. In the end, it carried the boy clear of the slaughter by sheer will, and flew him back to Dragonstone bleeding the whole way. And there, having brought its rider home, it lay down and died. The prince lived. His dragon was gone forever, and dragons, once dead, do not come again. The younger boy had no dragon and no way out. The cog that carried him was overrun, and he was taken alive off her deck by men who understood the value of a Targaryen prince held for ransom. For a long while, his own mother believed him dead among the wreckage. He was not, but that was cold comfort in the days after the Gullet, when no one on Dragonstone yet knew it. The dragons did what dragons do, even so. Before the fighting ended, they had burned the heart out of the Triarchy fleet. By any cold reckoning of the war, the Blacks had won. The sea lanes at the mouth of Blackwater Bay were cleared, the foreign fleet shattered, the door to Rhaenyra's islands held. But it was a victory paid for in the one coin she could least afford to spend. It was one of the largest and bloodiest sea battles Westeros had ever seen. Hundreds of ships had gone to the bottom on both sides, and the Velaryon fleet that had ruled the narrow sea would never again be quite what it had been. The channel itself was left choked with the dead and the burning, a stretch of water so thick with ruin that ships would be picking their way through the bones of it for a long time to come. And Rhaenyra had bought all of it with her heir and one of her dragons, and did not even know whether her youngest son was alive or drowned. Dragons could win even upon the sea, where no dragon was ever meant to fight. But the Field of Fire, 100 years before, had cost the winning side fewer than 100 men, and not a single dragon. The Gullet cost the Blacks a prince, a dragon, and the greater part of a fleet, in exchange for a channel. That was the true face of the dance, and it grew clearer with every battle. The Targaryens could still burn any enemy who came against them. What they could no longer do was burn one another without bleeding for it. And in this war, both sides bled the same red blood, and both sides lost the same irreplaceable beasts. Every victory now came with a grave beside it, and the graves were beginning to hold the very weapon that had made the family unbeatable. In the ledgers of the war, the Gullet was written down as a black victory, and by the cold arithmetic of ships and sea lanes, this is true. The Triarchy had come to close the waters around Dragonstone and starve the blacks of the sea, and instead its fleet was scattered and burned and sent limping back toward the free cities with far fewer hulls than it had brought. The blockade never took shape. The channel between Dragonstone, Driftmark and the mouth of Blackwater Bay stayed open, and the ships that carried grain and men and word between Rhaenyra's islands could still pass. For a time, the sea approaches to her strongholds were safe again. On a map, in a maester's hand, it looked like exactly the outcome she had needed. But wars are not fought on maps, and grief does not read ledgers. Rhaenyra had gone into the dance with a great and simple strength, more dragons than her rivals, and sons to ride them. That strength was bleeding away, and the Gullet took the cruelest cut of all. Jacaerys had been her eldest living son, her heir, the boy who would have carried her claim forward after she was gone. He had flown into that slaughter to save his little brothers, and the sea had swallowed him for it. A queen who wins a channel and loses the future of her line has not made a bargain any mother would call a victory. Nor was the loss only hers to feel. The House of Valerian had thrown its whole strength behind Rhaenyra. Its ships, its wealth, its blood. The fleet that had ruled the narrow sea under the old sea snake had been ground down in the Gullet, and the family's sons were dying in her cause, one after another. Every death in that channel tightened the war a little further, hardened it, drove out whatever mercy still lingered at the edges of it. Men who have lost a son do not fight the way they fought before. They fight to make someone pay. The rage was the truer legacy of the Gullet. The dance had begun as a quarrel over a chair, argued by councils and sealed with dragons. It was becoming something else now, something that fed on its own losses. Each side had learned that the other could be hurt, that a dragon could be dragged from the sky and a prince killed in the water, and having learned it, neither could unlearn it. The killing spread outward from the battlefields into bedchambers and back stairs, into acts that no herald would ever announce and no singer would set to music. The war grew uglier with every month, and the men who waged it grew uglier with it. The Gullet did not start that descent, but it poured oil on it, and the flames climbed higher, and beneath all of it, quiet and steady, ran the loss that neither side would fully understand until it was too late. 2 dragons had died in the Gullet. Vermax fell into the sea beneath Jacaerys and never rose. Stormcloud, the young beast that had carried the elder rescued prince, flew home to Dragonstone with 12 wounds in its hide and lay down and died in the yard, having spent the last of its strength to bring its rider clear. 2 dragons, gone in a single afternoon on the water. The men on both sides thought of dragons the way they thought of ships and swords and gold, as weapons to be spent in the winning of the war, terrible and valuable, but replaceable. In this they were wrong, and the error sat at the very center of everything the Targaryens were doing to themselves. A galley sunk could be rebuilt. A knight killed could be replaced by his son. A dragon lost was lost forever. There were only so many of the great beasts in all the world, and every one that went into the sea or the fire took with it something that could never be made again. No shipwright, no smith, no lord in Westeros could put a dragon back into the sky once the sea had taken it. That is the lesson the Gullet ought to have taught, and did not. The Blacks counted their reopened sea lanes and mourned their prince, and marched on into the war. The Greens did the same with their own losses on other fields, and all the while the number of dragons in the world was falling, battle by battle, and it would never climb again. The dance was consuming the one thing that had raised House Targaryen above every other house in Westeros. Aegon had conquered the 7 kingdoms with 3 dragons. His descendants, 100 years later, had more than a dozen, and they were burning them against one another as though the supply were endless. Every dragon that died in that water was a dragon that would not be there for the next battle, or the one after, and there was no bottom to that account that ended anywhere but empty. This is the quiet truth the Gullet buried beneath its wreckage. The Blacks had won the Channel and paid for it in blood they could not spare, and the same story would be told again and again before the dance was done. Each side kept spending dragons to win ground, and each dragon spent brought them both a step closer to the day when there would be no dragons left at all. The war for the Iron Throne was slowly, methodically killing the very thing that made the throne worth holding. The fire that had forged it, the beast that had built the dynasty, the advantage no rival house could ever match. The Channel healed faster than the family did. In time, the wreckage settled, and ships learned again to pick their way through the drowned bones of the fleets. And the Gullet became once more a stretch of water that traders crossed without a thought. Somewhere to the west, in the green heart of the Riverlands, other dragons still flew for both causes, older and larger and more terrible than anything that had fought in the Gullet. They too would be spent before the end. The dance had a hunger in it now, and it had begun to feed on the greatest beasts of all. The Riverlands were the crossroads of the war, and everything of consequence seemed to be dragged there sooner or later. Rich in fields and rivers, held by lords who could not agree which claimant to fear more, it was ground both sides needed, and neither could hold for long. Armies of black and green marched and countermarched across it, burning what they could not carry. And at the heart of it, beside the great lake called the God's Eye, stood Harrenhal. It was the same Harrenhal that Aegon had burned in the conquest, its towers half melted, its stones scorched, a ruin so vast that a garrison could rattle around inside it like coins in an empty chest. Men called it cursed, and the war seemed determined to prove them right. It had changed hands more than once already, and now the Blacks held it. Prince Daemon Targaryen had taken the castle for Rhaenyra and made it his seat in the Riverlands. Daemon was the most dangerous man the Black cause had. Brother to the dead king, uncle and husband to the queen, he had spent his life at war. Pirate hunting in the Stepstones, where he had won and worn a crown, and quarrelling with every council that ever tried to leash him. Men called him the Rogue Prince. He rode Caraxes, the bloodworm, a lean red dragon with a long neck and a longer memory of battle, quick and vicious and utterly without fear. Together they had killed on land and in the air, and neither had ever met an enemy that beat them. Across the war from him stood a younger man who wanted him dead. Prince Aemon Targaryen was the second son of the old king by his second wife, a cold, proud, one-eyed prince who had lost the eye as a boy and never forgiven the world for it. In its place, he wore a sapphire. What he had gained in exchange was worth more than any eye. As a boy, he had claimed the greatest dragon left alive, and he had grown into her rider. That dragon was Vhagar. She was the last living link to the conquest. Visenya Targaryen had ridden her over the field of fire more than 100 years before, when 3 dragons burned the 2 kings and their host into the earth, and won the throne that all these men were now fighting over. Every dragon that had shared the sky with her that day was long dead. Vhagar had outlived them all. A century of feeding had made her monstrous. The oldest, largest, heaviest dragon in the world, so vast that the ground shook when she landed, and the light dimmed when she passed overhead. No living thing could match her in the air. The fire that had built House Targaryen was still alive, and it answered to a boy with a sapphire eye who meant to turn it on his own kin. The grudge between the 2 princes had a long and bloody history. It had been Aemond, early in the war, who caught young Lucerys over Storm's End and set Vhagar on him, killing the boy and his little dragon in a storm. The first prince to die in the dance, and the death that turned a cold quarrel hot. Lucerys had been Rhaenyra's son and Daemon's stepson. In answer, Daemon had loosed his own kind of murder into the halls of the Red Keep, and a child of the Greens had died screaming for it. Each side blamed the other for the worst of what the war had become, and both were right. Between Daemon and Aemond, the accounts had grown too long and too red to be settled any way but one. When Aemond and his host quit Harrenhal and left it to the Blacks, Daemon did not simply let him go. He sent a challenge. He named the place and dared Aemon to meet him there alone, dragon against dragon, prince against prince, above the waters of the God's Eye. Aemond came. He did not bring his army, and neither did Daemon. Whatever else these 2 were, they were Targaryens to the bone, and there was a terrible pride in both of them that would not be answered by anything less than single combat in the sky. Aemon flew to Harrenhal on Vhagar and found the vast ruin silent, its yards empty, no banners on the walls. He circled the towers, hunting, and then, from the highest of them, from the scorched top of the great tower that Aegon's fire had left half-slumped a century before, Caraxes rose to meet him, with Daemon on his back. The sky over the God's Eye had darkened. A storm was gathering above the lake, the clouds piling black and heavy, the wind rising, the surface of the water going grey and rough far below. Into that murk the 2 dragons climbed higher and higher, until the men who watched from the ground could barely make them out. 2 dark shapes wheeling and circling one another in the failing light, each looking for the height, the angle, the moment. Then they closed. They came together with a sound that carried for leagues, fire against fire, and locked. Caraxes was fast and savage, but Vhagar was a mountain with wings, and in a straight contest of size and strength, there could be only one ending. The old dragon's jaws found the blood worm and would not let go. They fell together, tangled and burning, teeth in flesh and claws in wings, tumbling out of the storm toward the black water of the lake. Daemon knew, he must have known, that Caraxes was going to lose, and that he was going to die with him. So he spent his death. At the last moment, with the 2 dragons locked and plunging, Daemon rose to his feet on Caraxes' back. He drew Dark Sister, the ancestral Valyrian steel blade his house had carried since the days of old Valyria, and he leapt. He crossed the empty air between the 2 falling beasts and landed on Vhagar's back, behind the sapphire-eyed prince who had killed his stepson. And he drove the sword down through Aemon's blind eye and out through the back of his throat before the younger man could turn. It was not a stroke meant to win a duel. It was a stroke meant to make certain that his enemy died with him. Daemon had no way down and no way home. Caraxes was dying beneath him. Vhagar was falling. The lake was rushing up. He had climbed onto a doomed dragon to kill a man he could not otherwise reach, and he did it, and then the water took them all. Both dragons struck the god's eye. Both riders went down with them. Vhagar, the last dragon of the conquest, the fire of the field of fire, sank into the cold lake with a dead prince still in the saddle, and never rose again. Caraxes dragged himself out of the water and onto the shore below Harrenhal, torn open and broken, and there he lay down and died. Of Daemon there was nothing. His body was never found. The fool Mushroom would later claim the prince had never truly leapt at all, that he had turned Caraxes aside and flown off to die in some quiet corner of the world. Septon Eustace held plainly that the sword stroke was Daemon's last act, and the cold lake his grave, and that is the version most have believed. Aemon's body was recovered later from the shallows, the crushed remains of a prince with a Valyrian blade still buried in the ruin of his eye. Two of the finest warriors of their generation, two of the greatest dragons in the world, had met above one lake, and in the space of a few minutes all four were gone. There was no victor. There was no field held, no prize taken, no banner raised over the fallen. There was only the water closing over the wreckage of both, and the storm breaking at last, and the silence afterward. Nothing in all the dance was more concentrated than this. Two princes, two dragons, and one lake, and an ending that belonged to no one. It was the truest picture of the whole war. The Targaryens had turned the fire of the conquest inward, and above the god's eye it consumed both hands that reached for it at once. Vhagar was the last dragon of the conquest. A dragon like that could not be made again by wanting one. Dragons still hatched in the years after her death, and some grew large in time, but none of them had a century of feeding behind them, and none of them ever matched her. When Vhagar sank into the god's eye, the single most powerful weapon in the world sank with her, and both sides had spent it to kill one man. For the Greens, it was a blow they never recovered from. Vhagar had been their strength made visible, the reason their cause could still frighten anyone. With her gone and Aemon gone, King Aegon's side had lost its fiercest prince and its deadliest dragon in one stroke. For the Blacks, the price was equally steep. Daemon had been the sword arm of Rhaenyra's whole war, the one commander both friend and foe took seriously, and Caraxes had been among the most battle-hardened dragons alive. Two causes that were already bleeding had each lost the best of what they had, and neither had a victory to show for it. What followed was a war of grief and murder. The dragons that were left began to die in ways that had nothing to do with glory. Some fell to one another, kin-beast against kin-beast, the way Vhagar and Caraxes had. Others were killed on the ground. When Rhaenyra took King's Landing, the city she had won turned on her, and a great mob rose in the night and stormed the dragon pit, where the beasts were kept chained beneath their dome. Unarmed men and women threw themselves at monsters with nothing but torches and spears and their own bodies, and they died in their hundreds. But the dragons died too. Cornered under the dome, unable to fly, the great beasts were pulled down and butchered by the very small folk who had once knelt to their riders. It was a slaughter on both sides, and when it was over, several more dragons that could never be replaced were simply gone. The pattern held to the end. Rhaenyra herself was driven from the city she had claimed, hunted back to Dragonstone, and there she was fed to a dying dragon while her one surviving son watched. Her rival did not long outlive her. Before the fighting stopped, nearly every dragon that had flown into the dance had been killed in it, and most of the princes and princesses who rode them were dead as well. The family had set out to decide which Targaryen would sit the Iron Throne, and in deciding it, they had destroyed the thing that made a Targaryen worth fearing at all. When the war finally ended, and a boy king was set on the throne to rule a realm sick of blood, only a handful of dragons remained in all the world, and they were small, or sickly, or wild. They did not thrive. Over the years that followed, they weakened and dwindled, laying clutches that would not hatch, growing thin in their caverns, until the last of them died a stunted, wretched thing, no larger than a dog. After that, there were no dragons at all. The eggs turned to stone. The Targaryens went on ruling, but they ruled as men now, with laws and marriages and armies of ordinary soldiers, the same as any other great house. The wings were gone. The dance settled this above the God's Eye more completely than anywhere else. The war did not end House Targaryen. It ended the age of dragons. Aegon the Conqueror had taken a whole continent from the back of a beast that no army could touch, and for a century after him, the family's power had rested on that simple fact, that they had dragons, and no one else did. The dance burned that advantage away from the inside. The Targaryens killed their own dragons faster than the world could ever have killed them, and when the killing was done, the beasts were gone forever, and no amount of blood or gold or wanting would bring them back. Everything that came after was shaped by that loss, though the men living through it did not always see it. The Targaryens still held the throne, and for a long while no one had the strength to take it from them. The throne was only a chair now. The power that had guarded it was dead. A dynasty that had once answered every challenge with fire now had to answer with the same steel as everyone else. The balance of power had forever changed. It would take a long time for anyone to test it. More than a century and a half would pass between the death of Vhagar and the next great reckoning that decided who would wear the crown. But when that reckoning came, it came without a single dragon on either side. The heirs of the Conqueror rode to war on horses, in armor, carrying swords and hammers, exactly like the lords who opposed them. The fire that had won the throne at the Field of Fire and turned inward at the Gullet and above the God's Eye had finally gone out, and it did not come back. Above the God's Eye, the age of dragons burned itself out. Everything that followed, all the way down to a river called the Trident, would be fought by men who had only steel, and the throne they fought for would be won and lost by men who could bleed and die like any other. The years after the dance were quiet in the way that exhaustion is quiet. The realm had bled itself pale, and no one had the appetite to reach for the throne again. The Targaryens went on ruling, king after king, and the crown passed down the line the way crowns do, sometimes to strong men, sometimes to weak ones, sometimes through murder and sometimes in peace. But it passed without wings. The last dragons had dwindled and died, and within a few short generations, no living soul in Westeros had ever seen one in the sky. The family that had conquered a continent from the air now sat their melted chair like any other lord sat his hall, guarded by walls and swords and the loyalty of other men. For a long while, that was enough. Fear has a long memory, and the memory of dragonfire outlived the dragons themselves. Lords who had never seen a Targaryen dragon still spoke of the Field of Fire, still knew what the family had once been. That memory held the piece together far longer than steel alone could have. But memory is not the same as strength, and by the reign of Aerys II, the difference had become fatal. Aerys had begun as a hopeful king and curdled into a cruel and frightened one. He saw treason in every shadow. He trusted no one, least of all his own son, and the realm learned to walk carefully around a man who could order horrors on a whim. The lords endured it, as lords do, because the alternative was worse, and because the Targaryens had always been endured. What none of them understood yet was that the thing that had made a Targaryen untouchable was already 100 years dead. The break, when it came at a tourney. In the 281st year after Aegon's conquest, the great houses gathered at Harrenhal for the largest tournament in living memory. The same Harrenhal that Aegon had burned at the very start of it all, its towers still slumped and blackened above the god's eye. It should have been a celebration. Instead, it became the hinge on which everything turned. When Prince Rhaegar Targaryen won the joust, he rode past his own wife, Elia Martell of Dorne, and laid the crown of winter roses in the lap of Lyanna Stark, a northern girl already promised to another man. He named her the Queen of Love and Beauty, and in that single gesture, before a crowd of thousands, something broke that could not be mended. It was the moment when all the smiles died. What followed the next year moved with terrible speed. Lyanna Stark vanished from the road, taken by Rhaegar, and the North cried out for her. Her brother Brandon rode to King's Landing and demanded the prince come out and answer for it. For that, Aerys seized him. When Lord Rickard Stark, Brandon's father, came south to answer for his son, the king killed them both. It was a death so cruel that even hardened men who witnessed it never spoke of it easily afterward. Then Aerys sent word to the Eyrie demanding the heads of 2 young men fostered there, Robert Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, who had been betrothed to Lyanna, and Eddard Stark, now the head of a butchered house. Jon Arryn, their foster father, refused. Instead of sending 2 heads, he raised his banners, and with that, the rebellion began. It was a war of hard marches and desperate fights. The Vale rose behind Arryn. Robert broke free and raced for the Stormlands to raise his own men, winning at Gulltown to open the way. He fought 3 battles in a single day at Summerhall to keep from being crushed before he could gather. But the crown pushed back. At Ashford, a Reach host under Lord Randall Tarley caught Robert's men before they were ready and beat them badly. Robert was driven into hiding in the town of Stony Sept, wounded and hunted, sheltered by a woman in a brothel called the Peach, while the king's men tore the town apart searching for him house by house. The man leading that search was Jon Connington, Lord of Griffin's Roost and Aerys's Hand, and he failed. He knew Robert was somewhere in Stony Sept and could not find him. Then the rebel army fell on the town, and the bells rang out over a running fight through the streets that ended with Robert alive, and Connington broken and driven from his post. The Battle of the Bells was more than a victory. It was the moment the war changed shape. Aerys understood at last that Robert Baratheon was the deadliest threat the throne had faced since Daemon Blackfire. A man who could not be caught, could not be killed, and could not be stopped from gathering the realm behind him. After the bells, the rebellion found its footing. Robert and Eddard came to River Run, and there Lord Hoster Tully sold his loyalty at the price of 2 marriages. His daughter Catelyn wed to Eddard, and his daughter Lysa to Jon Arryn. A double wedding bound the Riverlands to the cause. With the Vale, the North and Stormlands behind him, Robert Baratheon set aside any pretense of merely fighting for his life and announced his claim to the Iron Throne itself. The crown gathered to meet him. Rhaegar, who had been absent for much of the war, returned at last from the south to take command of the royal army, and it was a great one, near 40,000 men. 10,000 of them were Dornish spearmen under Prince Lewin Martell, sent north under a threat, for the Mad King held Rhaegar's wife Elia and her children in the Red Keep. These hostages ensured that Dorne stayed loyal to the crown. There were also the survivors of the fighting at the Bells, the houses of the Crown Lands, and a sizable host from the Reach. 2 knights of the Kingsguard were sent ahead to rally what remained of Connington's scattered men. On paper, the Crown held the stronger army by far. The rebels came on with fewer than 40,000 of their own, but they were hardened by a year of hard war. The Northmen marched under Eddard Stark. The Riverlanders came under the Tullys, though the Riverlands were divided against themselves. Houses like Darry, Mooton, and Rhaegar still held to the king. The Vale Knights rode under Arryn's banner, and Stormlanders had thrown in with Robert from the start. Only Walder Frey held back, slow to bring his strength across the Green Fork, waiting to see which way the war would fall before he committed a single man. The 2 armies converged on the Trident, the great river at the heart of the realm, where the King's Road crossed the water on its way to the capital. The Crown had the numbers. The Crown had the seasoned commanders and the Dornish spears, and the whole weight of the throne behind it. But the throne had nothing else. This was the truth of the Targaryen power at the time. The dynasty that the Field of Fire had built, and that the dance had nearly destroyed, now stood on the banks of the Trident without a single dragon to its name. For 300 years, a Targaryen host in trouble had always held one final answer in reserve: the sky. But the sky was now empty, save for the vultures circling hungrily above. When Rhaegar's army and Robert's army met at the river, they would meet as equals in the only way that now mattered, matched steel against steel, hammer against sword, numbers and courage and luck, and that changed everything. For the first time since Aegon landed, the Iron Throne was there to be won by a man with a hammer in his hands. They met at a ford. The Trident is 3 rivers joined, and it was at a crossing on the Green Fork that the 2 hosts finally came together, in a place that had no name worth remembering before that day. Rhaegar's army was trying to cross the water and drive north up the King's Road. Robert's army stood to stop him. The ground gave neither side the sky, neither side a wall, nothing but the river and the men on either bank, and the will to take the crossing. Rhaegar led the charge himself. He came in his black armor, the 3-headed dragon of his house worked in rubies across his breastplate, and he threw the weight of the royal host at the ford to force his way through. The fighting closed in the shallows, thousands of men wading into a river that ran red before the afternoon was done. There was no maneuver left to it, no cleverness. It was a brawl in the water, and it was decided the way such brawls are decided, by who broke first. Robert was everywhere his men could see him. He fought with the great war hammer forged for him by his own armourer, a weapon few other men could have swung and fewer still could have swung all day. His voice carried over the din, that huge battlefield roar of his, and where it carried, the rebels held. Whatever else Robert Baratheon was, in a fight, he was the kind of man other men would follow into the deep water, and on the Trident that was worth more than any banner. The hardest pressure fell on Robert's left, and it came from Dorne. Prince Lewin Martell had brought 10,000 spearmen north, and though he had come under a threat, with his own kin held hostage in the capital, his men fought like the war was theirs. The Dornish spears bit deep into the rebel flank and threatened to demolish it entirely. For a time, the whole battle hung on whether that flank would hold. It was there that one of the war's small, brutal turns was made. Lord Corbray of the Vale fell in the press. His son, Sir Lyn Corbray, took up the ancestral Valyrian blade the family carried into war, Lady Forlorn, a sword old enough to have drunk from 100 years of Vale quarrels, and threw himself into the Dornish spears. He broke them. Where the flank had been buckling, Lyn Corbray carved it back open, and in the ruin of the Dornish charge, he came upon Prince Lewin Martell, already wounded, and killed him. The 10,000 spears of Dorne had been sent north under duress, and they died for a king who was holding their prince's family as ransom. It was a bitter thing, and Dorne would not forget it. Elsewhere on the field, the finest swords of both sides did the work such men do. Sir Barristan Selmy of the Kingsguard was a legend already, and he fought that day the way legends are made. Men later said he killed a dozen in the fighting, cutting through the rebel ranks until his own blood ran freely with the rest. On Robert's side, Lord Jason Mallister rode down 3 of Rhaegar's bannermen, one after another. All along the ford, house after house spent its best men in the water, and still neither line broke. And then the 2 men the whole war was built around found each other in the stream. There is no full accounting of how Robert and Rhaegar came face to face in the middle of that river. Battles are chaos, and the meeting of the 2 claimants was less a duel arranged than an inevitability finally arriving. But meet they did in the shallows, the crown prince against the man who would take his family's throne. A hammer against a sword in a foot of running water, with the fate of a dynasty riding on the outcome. Rhaegar was a fine warrior. He was younger than Robert, disciplined, well-trained, and armoured in the best steel the crown could forge. None of it was enough. Robert Baratheon, in a killing rage, was a force few men in the history of the realm could have stood against. And he fought that day for a girl he believed had been stolen from him, with the crown a distant second thought. When the moment came, he brought the warhammer down and crushed the breastplate over Rhaegar's heart, caving in the prince's chest with a single blow. The rubies of the dragon burst loose on impact and scattered across the water, winking red as they sank into the mud of the ford. Men would gather them for years afterward, and they gave the crossing the only name it has been known by since, the Ruby Ford. Rhaegar Targaryen, the last hope of his house, the prince who had crowned Lyanna Stark Queen of Love and Beauty and set the whole ruin in motion, died there in the river. It was said he spoke Lyanna's name with his last breath. Whatever he meant by it, he took it with him into the water. With Rhaegar dead, the royal army had nothing left to fight for. A host will hold as long as it believes it can win, and the men who had crossed the Trident for the crown had believed in the prince at their head. Now he lay broken in the shallows, and the belief went out of them all at once. The line that had held all afternoon came apart. The royalists broke and ran, and the killing turned from a battle into a rout, as the rebels drove the survivors from the field. Barristan Selmy was among the fallen, grievously wounded, dragged near lifeless from the fighting where he had spent himself killing rebels by the handful. When he was brought before Robert, there were voices urging the new king to be done with him. Roose Bolton, cold and quiet, counselled that a dangerous man was best made a dead one. Robert would not have it. He had watched Barristan fight, and he honored the courage of it, and he ordered the old knight to be treated for his wounds. And so the field fell quiet, the water running slow and red toward the sea, the royal banners trampled into the mud. This was the true fall of the Targaryen dynasty. Everything that followed, the sack, the throne room, the deaths in the Red Keep, was aftermath. It was here, in a foot of river water, that 300 years of Dragon Kings ended, under a single blow from a single hammer, swung by a man with no dragon and no crown, and nothing but grief and muscle to his name. The family that had conquered a continent from the sky had at last been beaten the way any other house could be beaten, in a river, by a stronger arm. The throne their fire had built now belonged, in all but name, to the man who had crushed their heir into the ruby ford. What remained was only to go and take it. But taking it was not so simple as it sounded. The victory at the ruby ford had been complete, yet it had cost Robert more than his men liked to admit. Rhaegar had not died meekly. In the fighting before the hammer fell, the prince had wounded Robert, and the wound was serious enough that the new king could not ride at the head of his own pursuit. The man who had just broken a dynasty found himself laid up while the war was still, in truth, unfinished. A battle won is not a throne won, and the throne lay 100 miles south, in a city no rebel army had yet come near. So Robert did what a commander must. Unable to lead the chase himself, he gave the vanguard to the man he trusted above all others. Eddard Stark took command of the foremost host and drove south down the King's Road after the broken loyalists, running down the survivors of the Trident as they fled toward the capital. The friendship between the two men was old and deep, forged in the Vale under Jon Arryn's roof, and Robert put the sharp end of his army into Ned's hands without a second thought. It was Stark, not Baratheon, who would ride first for King's Landing. As the rebels took the measure of what they had won, the shape of the war became plain. The royal host had been the last great army the crown could field, and it was scattered now, its commanders dead in the water, its men streaming south with no prince to rally to. The road to King's Landing lay open. There was no second wall between the rebels and the Red Keep, no fresh loyalist host waiting to bar the way. The only significant force still standing for the Targaryens was far to the south, and it was doing nothing that mattered. Mace Tyrell had marched the strength of the Reach to Storm's End and sat down before its walls, penning Robert's brother Stannis inside with a siege that would not end for the better part of a year. That army was large, but it was fixed in place, hundreds of miles from the capital and out of the war for all practical purposes. It could not save King's Landing. It could not even reach it in time. Robert, for his part, had proclaimed himself the rightful heir before the fighting had even begun. In the years that followed, the Maesters would dress his claim in Targaryen blood, tracing it back through his grandmother Rhael, a Targaryen princess married into House Baratheon a generation before. It made a tidy line on a page, but no one who had stood at the Trident was fooled about how the crown was truly being won. Robert did not take the throne because of a grandmother. He took it because he had crushed the heir to it in a river. Conquest wearing the clothes of inheritance, and the men who had bled for him knew the difference. And then, with the way south open and victory seemingly a matter of days, word reached the rebels that changed the entire calculation. Tywin Lannister was on the march. The Lord of Casterly Rock had sat out the whole war. Through every battle, every burning, every desperate hour, the great power of the Westerlands had stayed behind its own borders and watched. Neither side had been able to move him. Aerys had married his son into the king's guard, as much to keep a hostage as to honour the house, and still Tywin had given the crown nothing. Robert had courted him and gotten nothing. The most powerful lord in the realm had spent the rebellion doing precisely what he judged would leave him strongest at the end of it, waiting to see which way it fell. Now, with the fall decided, he had finally roused himself. A great host out of the west was moving on the capital, and no one among the rebels could say what it meant. Tywin might be coming to defend the king at last, arriving as the loyal warden of the west to save his king in his darkest hour. He might be coming to seize the city for himself. He might be coming to bend the knee to Robert with a bloodless gift. His banners told nothing, and his intentions told less. The most dangerous man in Westeros was marching on an undefended city, and he had never once in the whole war shown his hand. This was what turned the march south into a race. Two armies were now converging on the same open gate, and only one of them belonged to a man whose loyalty could be named. Eddard Stark drove his vanguard hard down the King's Road, running to reach King's Landing ahead of the Lannister army. Behind the vanguard, the ordinary reckoning of a battle went on. Barristan Selmy, healed on Robert's order, would live to serve the very man who had unhorsed a dynasty at the Trident, a piece of mercy that bound the old knight to the new king by a debt of blood. Walder Frey, who had promised his swords to the rebel cause and then found reason after reason to keep them at the Twins, finally arrived with his host once every blow had already been struck. He came when there was no more fighting to be done, and Robert's men gave him the name he would carry to his grave for it, the late Lord Frey. It was meant as an insult, and Walder would nurse it like a grievance for the rest of his long life. There was one more shadow cast over the ford that no rebel felt at the time, because it fell on the losing side. Far away, a Lannister daughter had once been offered to Rhaegar Targaryen and passed over, and she had never forgiven the slight. When Cersei Lannister looked back on the Trident in the years that came, she would say that the wrong man had died in that river. She had wanted the prince, and she had gotten the wounded, roaring stranger who killed him instead. It was a small and private bitterness on the day it was born, and it would grow into something that helped pull the whole realm down. But all of that lay ahead. On the banks of the Trident, the truth was simpler and more urgent than any of it. The battle had answered one question and left another wide open. It had settled, beyond any doubt, who had lost the war. Rhaegar was dead, the royal army was scattered, and the Targaryen cause had no field left to make a stand on. What it had not settled was who would take the prize the war had been fought for. The Iron Throne still stood in a city with no army to defend it, and two hosts were racing to reach it, one led by Robert's most loyal friend, the other by a man who had spent 300 days proving that he served no one but himself. The Trident had decided who was beaten. King's Landing would decide who had won. And by racing an unknowable Tywin Lannister to an undefended gate, the rebels were about to learn the oldest lesson of the war they had just won: that the most dangerous man in the realm is the one who has never let anyone see which side he is on. While two armies raced for the capital, the man on the Iron Throne was preparing a welcome that would have made either of them wish they had come in second. Aerys Targaryen had loved fire for a long time before the war ever began. Over the years, his love had curdled into something that ruled him entirely. He kept the pyromancers of the Alchemist Guild close, and three of them, Rossart, Bellis, and Garrigus, came and went from the Red Keep at all hours, day and night, until the sight of their robes in the halls became ordinary. What they were doing was not ordinary at all. On the king's command, they had been making wildfire in enormous quantity and hiding it beneath the city, under the sept of Baelor, under the slums of Flea Bottom, under towers and stables and streets. Caches of green fire seeded through the ground the whole capital stood upon. Aerys called it his last defense. It was nothing of the kind. He had told those closest to him what he meant to do if the war came to his door, and it was madness given a shape. If he could not hold King's Landing, no one would hold it. He would put the whole city to the torch, every man, woman, and child in it. 500,000 lives turned to ash in a single burst of green flame, and rise from the ruin transformed. He believed, in the ruin of his mind, that the fire would remake him as a dragon. That was the welcome waiting behind the walls the rebels were hurrying toward. One man inside the keep had understood it before the end. Colton Chelsted served as hand of the king, and Chelsted was no fool. He watched the pyromancers coming and going. He pieced together what the caches were for, and he tried everything a servant of the crown could try to turn his king from it. He reasoned. He made light of it, as though it were only talk. He warned. In the end, he begged. When none of it moved Aerys, Chelsted did the only honest thing left to him and gave up the badge of his office, tearing the chain of the hand from his neck and throwing it down. For that act of conscience, the king had him dipped in the very substance he had tried to stop and burned alive. The office of the hand stood empty. Aerys did not leave it empty long. When word of the disaster at the Trident reached him, that Rhaegar was dead, the royal host shattered, the road north open, the king reached for the man who had never once told him no. He named Rossart, the chief pyromancer, his new hand of the king. It was a fitting choice for what he intended. The realm was being handed, in its final hours, to the man in charge of burning it. The same news brought a colder decision. With his heir dead and his enemies coming, Aerys sent his pregnant queen, Rhaella, and his young son Viserys away to the safety of Dragonstone, the ancient Targaryen seat across the bay. But he did not send everyone. He kept Rhaegar's wife, Elia Martell of Dorne, and her 2 small children, the little Princess Rhaenys and the infant Aegon, behind in the Red Keep with him. He kept them because his ruined mind had settled on a suspicion he could not shake. Prince Lewin Martell had commanded Dornish spears at the Trident and died there, and Aerys had convinced himself that the Dornishman had betrayed his son on the field, that Rhaegar had fallen because Dorne had turned. So he held Elia and her children as hostages against her people. 3 innocents kept close as a threat, in a castle sitting on a lake of wildfire. Into this came Tywin Lannister. About a fortnight after the Trident, the great host of the West arrived at the gates of King's Landing, and its lord sent word ahead that he had come at last to stand with his king in the crown's darkest hour. After a whole war of silence, Tywin Lannister was declaring for the Targaryens. He asked only that the gates be opened to a loyal friend. The king's council was split down the middle. Varys, the eunuch who traded in whispers and knew better than most how little Tywin gave without taking, urged Aerys to keep the gates shut and bar the Westermen out. Grand Maester Pycelle argued the other way. He counselled the king to open the gates to the noble Lord Tywin, to trust in the old loyalty of Casterly Rock and welcome the army that had come to save the city. Aerys, half mad and wholly desperate, listened to Pycelle. The gates of King's Landing swung open, and 12,000 Westermen marched in as friends. They came as friends and turned on the city the instant they were inside it. The sack of King's Landing began within the hour. Killing in the streets, women dragged from their homes, shops and houses put to the torch. The ordinary horror of a city given over to soldiers who have been told the plunder is theirs. It was ordered and deliberate, exactly as Tywin meant it. And while the mob of his army busied itself below, a hand-picked band of his best men cut straight through the burning streets toward the one prize that mattered, the Red Keep, and the Mad King inside it. The Red Keep was not undefended. Jaime Lannister, Tywin's own son and the youngest man ever to wear the white cloak of the Kingsguard, stood in the throne room with the king he had sworn to protect. When the screaming rose from the city, Jaime went to Aerys and asked him for terms. Some way to end it, some sanity. Aerys gave him an order instead. Believing to the last that Tywin had come to save him, the king commanded Jaime to go and bring him his father's head. And in the same breath, half to himself, Aerys sent a messenger with a different order. A single word passed to his new hand, Rossart, waiting somewhere in the city with the pyromancers. The word was to light the caches, slay them all. Jaime understood in that instant what the king meant to do. He learned that Rossart had already left the throne room, gone down into the streets to see the work done, and the whole shape of the plot fell into place. The years of green fire buried under the city, the mad dream of burning 500,000 people rather than lose them. There was no time to reason, and no one to reason with. Jaime went after Rossart first, cutting him down at a postern gate before he could reach the caches. Then he went back up to the throne room, to the man who had given the order. He killed Aerys Targaryen at the foot of the Iron Throne, opening the king's throat so he could never speak the word again. The last Dragon King died beneath the seat of melted swords his ancestor had made, killed by one of the 7 sworn to keep him alive. A moment later, the Westermen who had fought their way up burst in, Sir Ellis Westerling and Sir Roland Craighall among them, to find the deed already done and the young Kingsguard standing over the body. Jaime did not explain himself. He climbed the steps and sat down upon the Iron Throne to wait, the dead king at its feet, and when Eddard Stark rode into the hall at the head of the Northern Vanguard, he found the Golden Knight seated on the prize of the whole war. Ned stared him down until he rose from it. Jaime came away from the throne with a light word, that he was only keeping it warm for Robert, and let the North think whatever it liked of him. The city had not fallen to a siege. It had fallen to a lie. Tywin Lannister took King's Landing by making a mad king trust him at the single moment he should have trusted no one, and threw open a gate no army had managed to force. And beneath the murder that would follow Jaime for the rest of his life lay a truth he told no one, that a knight had broken the deepest vow he had to stop a king from burning 500,000 people, and would be called Kingslayer for it, and carry the reason alone for years. There was a colder calculation behind the sack than plunder, and it had nothing to do with the mad king dying in his throne room. Tywin Lannister had spent an entire war standing apart, watching to see which way the wind would blow. He had chosen his moment at the last, and now he needed to make his choice unmistakable. Robert Baratheon would take the throne, and Robert would ask himself, for the rest of his reign, whether the Lord of Casterly Rock was truly his man, or only a man who had backed the winner. Tywin meant to answer that question before it could be asked. He would hand the new king a gift no loyal lord could refuse and no honest one could stomach. Rhaegar was dead on the Trident, but Rhaegar had left heirs. His wife, Elia Martell, was still in the Red Keep with their 2 children, the little Princess Rhaenys, not yet 4 years old, and the infant Prince Aegon, still at the breast. As long as those children lived, there was a living Targaryen line with a claim older and truer than Robert's. A dragon prince left alive was a rebellion waiting for a cause. Tywin understood that a throne is never safe while a rival's blood still breathes, and so, to prove the depth of his loyalty, he sent men to end that line. He sent 2 of the worst men in his service. Sir Gregor Clegane was a knight in name and a monster in every other sense, a giant of a man whose cruelty was known across the Reach and the West long before that night. Sir Amory Lorch was smaller and meaner, a man who did ugly work without troubling himself over it. Together, they climbed into Maegor's Holdfast, the strongest keep within the Red Keep, where Elia and her children had been left, and they did what they had been sent to do. The details that survive are terrible, and they do not need dwelling on. Amory Lorch found the little Princess Rhaenys hidden beneath her father's bed, where a frightened child had gone to be safe. Gregor Clegane took the infant Aegon from his mother, and then he turned on Elia herself. The Princess of Dawn, a high-born lady who had done no wrong but marry a prince, was violated and murdered beside the bodies of her children. 3 innocents killed in the space of a few minutes to make one lord's loyalty plain. When it was done, the bodies were wrapped in crimson cloaks, Lannister colours, so there could be no mistaking who had done the deed or for whom, and carried down through the burning city to be laid before Robert Baratheon as tokens of fealty. Tywin presented them as a gift. Here was the last of Rhaegar's line, delivered dead to the new king, so that no dragon's son would ever rise to trouble him. The infant prince was so ruined that those who saw him could hardly call it a child at all. A small, broken horror of bone and blood, wrapped in red and set down at the feet of the man who had won the war. Robert looked at the dead children and did not flinch. Whatever he saw there, he had spent a war hating the family they belonged to, and the sight of Rhaegar's blood spilled did not move him to grief. He had wanted the dragons gone, root and branch, and here was the last of the brood delivered to him. That reaction, more than the murders themselves, told the men around him what kind of peace this was going to be, the full truth of who ordered what was never spoken plainly, and it has been argued over ever since. Tywin never denied that the children had to die. He would say, in later years, that a prince and princess of the old line left living would have been a standing danger, and that their deaths were a hard necessity of securing the realm. What he claimed not to have wanted was the manner of it. He had meant, so he said, only that the children be killed, quietly and cleanly. And it was Gregor Clegane's savagery that had turned a cold political killing into an atrocity that stained everyone near it. Whether that distinction was true or merely convenient, Tywin never handed Gregor over to answer for any of it, and a man is known by the servants he protects. There was another reading, and it came from Dorne. Prince Oberyn Martell, Elia's brother, never believed the killings were only a matter of statecraft. To the Martells it was murder dressed as a necessity, and worse, it was personal. Years before the war, Tywin had hoped to wed his daughter Cersei to Rhaegar, and Aerys had refused the match and taken Elia of Dorne for his son instead. Oberyn was convinced that Tywin had never forgiven that slight, and that when the chance came, he had chosen Elia's family to make his point precisely because Rhaegar had chosen Elia over a Lannister. In that reading, the sack was ambition and revenge together, paid in the blood of a woman and 2 children, for an insult 20 years stale. Which version held the greater truth was never settled, and the men who could have settled it had every reason to lie. None of it changed what had actually happened, or what it would cost. The war had been won on the Trident and the city taken by a lie. But it was in Maegor's holdfast, in the space of a few minutes, that the peace to come was truly shaped. Robert would sit a throne with the blood of murdered children under it, and everyone at court would know it and say nothing. Dawn would bend the knee because it had no choice, and would go on hating the men who had done this and the king who had thanked them for it, nursing that grief in silence for a generation, waiting. The name Gregor Clegane would become a byword for everything rotten in the new order, a monster kept and protected because he was useful. And Aelia's brother would carry his sister's death like a coal that never cooled, until at last it drew him back to King's Landing to collect a debt. This was the crime that poisoned the peace before it had even begun. Robert Baratheon won his crown on the Trident, but the throne he sat down upon was already stained on the day he claimed it, and the stain came from 3 bodies wrapped in crimson cloaks. It made an enemy of Dawn that no marriage and no honor could ever fully mend. It set a wound in the heart of the realm that would fester for 16 years and reopen at the worst possible moment. The dragons had been driven out, and the last of their line put to the sword, and the men who did it called it victory. It was the beginning of everything that would go wrong. The Mad King was dead. The Dragon Prince was dead on the Trident, and the last of Rhaegar's line lay wrapped in crimson at the foot of the throne. There was nothing left to conquer. What remained was the far harder work of turning a rebellion into a reign, and it began with a quarrel that never truly healed. Eddard Stark reached the capital not long after the fighting ended, and he saw what Tywin had laid before the new king. To Eddard, there was no cold logic that could excuse it. A woman and 2 small children had been butchered in their beds, and the man who ordered it had been thanked for the deed. He called it murder plainly to Robert's face, and he expected his friend to feel the same horror he did. Robert did not. To him, they were dragonspawn, the seed of the family that had stolen Lyanna and killed Brandon and Rickard, the brood he had gone to war to end. He would not weep for them, and he would not condemn the men who had spared him the trouble of hunting them down himself. The 2 men who had been closer than brothers stood on opposite sides of a gulf that would not close. Jon Arryn had raised them both, and he tried now to stand between them. But there are quarrels no foster father can mend. Neither would yield. Eddard would not call murder anything but murder, and Robert would not spend the first days of his reign apologizing for a victory. So Eddard did what he always did, when honor and friendship pulled against each other. He turned his back and rode away. He went south with his own men, out of the ruined city, to lift the siege of Storm's End, where Mace Tyrell's host still sat waiting for a war that was already lost. From there, he would ride further south still, to a lonely tower in the mountains of Dawn, on an errand that had nothing to do with thrones. The rift between Robert and Ned lasted a long while. Grief healed it in the end. Nothing else could have. Both men had loved Lyanna Stark, one as a brother and one as the woman he had meant to marry. When the truth of her fate finally reached them, the shared weight of losing her did what nothing else could. They came back together over a grave, but that reconciliation lay ahead, and it would always carry a silence at its center, because Eddard came home from that tower keeping a secret he would never share with the man he had made his peace with. While Eddard rode south, Tywin Lannister set about tidying the realm, the way a careful lord tidies a ledger. The men who had stayed loyal to Aerys to the last were given a simple choice: take the black and go to the wall, or die where they stood. Some, like Sir Jeremy Riker and the knight Sir Alistair Thorne, chose the black and marched north to spend the rest of their lives guarding a frozen wall for a king they had never wanted. Others were less fortunate. The winners, meanwhile, were folded quietly into the new order. Jaime Lannister, who had killed the king he was sworn to protect, was pardoned and kept his white cloak. Varys the eunuch, who had served Aerys and outlived him, kept his place. Grand Maester Pycelle, whose council had opened the gates, kept his chain. Loyalty, it turned out, mattered less than usefulness, and the men who understood that survived. There was one last piece of dangerous knowledge still loose in the city. Jaime alone knew about the caches of wildfire buried beneath King's Landing, and he knew the pyromancers who had placed them were still alive. Two of them, Bellis and Garrigos, had served the Mad King's dream of burning his own capital to ash. Jaime hunted them down and had them killed, quietly, so that the secret of the substance under the streets would die with the men who had made it. He told no one why. It was one more thing he chose to carry alone. Then Tywin secured his family's place in the new world, the way great houses always had, with a marriage. Robert Baratheon needed a queen, and the Lord of Casterly Rock had a daughter of marriageable age and famous beauty. Cersei Lannister was wed to the new king, binding the wealth and swords of the West to the throne, and turning the man who had come late to the war into the father of the queen and the grandfather of kings to come. It was a shrewd match, and a cold one. Robert did not love Cersei, and never would. He had given his heart to a dead woman, and he would spend the rest of his life reaching for the ghost of her at the bottom of a cup and in the beds of other women. The queen, who sat beside him, knew it from the start, and never forgave it. So the shape of the peace was set. Robert Baratheon had won a throne he had never truly wanted. He had gone to war for vengeance and for a woman, and now the crown was his, and the woman was in the ground. And the ruling of the realm bored and wearied him from the very first day. He left the governing to better men, to Jon Arryn, whom he made his hand, and to the small council, and increasingly to the debts he ran up and never meant to pay. He was a warrior with no war left to fight, and it slowly hollowed him out. Beneath the throne he sat upon, the crimes that had won it were never answered. No one paid for Elia and her children. Gregor Clegane went home to his lands. Tywin was rewarded, not punished. The marriage that secured the reign held nothing but resentment. Far to the south, Dawn bowed its head and bided its time, tending a grief it did not speak of, waiting for a moment that might be years or decades in coming. And in the north, Eddard Stark raised his children in the cold and the quiet, faithful to a promise no living soul but him understood, a promise made at a tower where his sister had died. The realm was at peace. The banners were furled, the roads were open, the harvest came in. To a man looking at it from the outside, the Seven Kingdoms had never seemed more settled. But peace is not the same thing as healing, and this peace had been built over wounds that no one had troubled to close. Every one of them was still there, buried in the foundation like the wildfire under the streets. The murdered Martells, the loveless marriage, the friends divided by blood they could not agree to forgive, the secret in the north, the debt owed to Dawn. The stone looked solid, but every fault line that would one day crack the realm apart was already set into it on the very day the new king sat down. The new reign had begun exactly as the old dynasty had begun 300 years before, with a throne taken by force and paid for in blood. The winners would rather not remember. The dragons had been driven out, the war had been won, the crown had changed hands. But a throne won that way is never truly finished being paid for. Every wound left unhealed at the sack was simply a war that had not happened yet. 16 years passed, and the stone held. Then, one by one, the wounds left unhealed at the sack tore open, and they tore open in the order they had been made. It began with a death that looked like an accident. Jon Arryn, the old hand who had raised Robert and Eddard both, and had spent his life holding the peace together, sickened suddenly and died. He had been the one man clever enough and trusted enough to keep the realm running while the king drank and hunted and grew fat. With him gone, Robert did the natural thing and sent north for the one friend he still trusted. And Eddard Stark came south again to the city he had ridden away from in disgust all those years before. Eddard came to serve, and instead he started pulling at a thread. Jon Arryn had died chasing a secret, and Eddard chased it after him until he found the thing at the bottom of it. Robert's children were not Robert's at all. Cersei Lannister's 3 golden children had been fathered by her own brother Jaime, the very man who had killed the Mad King and kept his white cloak. It was the loveless marriage from the first days of the reign, come to its poisoned fruit. Eddard, being who he was, chose to warn the queen rather than strike first, and gave her the chance to flee. It cost him everything. Robert died of a bore and too much wine before Eddard could tell him, and the moment the old king was cold, the trap closed. Eddard was named a traitor, and on the steps of the great sept of Baelor, before a screaming crowd, the boy King Joffrey had his head struck off. That single stroke shattered the realm. With Eddard dead and his secret loose, no one who mattered believed Joffrey had any right to the throne, and the men who might have held the peace instead reached for it. 5 of them, all at once. In the north, Robb Stark was raised up as king in the north to avenge his father. On the islands, Balon Greyjoy crowned himself again and turned his ships against the northern coast. In King's Landing sat Joffrey, propped up by his mother and his grandfather's gold. And in the Stormlands and on Dragonstone stood the 2 brothers of the dead king, Renly and Stannis Baratheon, each claiming the crown was his by right. The quarrel between the 2 brothers decided more than any of them knew. Renly was the younger, with no true claim at all while Stannis lived. But he was charming where Stannis was hard, and men love a smiling lord. He married Margaery Tyrell, and in doing so, won the backing of the Reach. The vast wealth and the enormous host of Highgarden, the same Highgarden that House Tyrell had held ever since Aegon raised up their steward ancestor after the Field of Fire. With the Reach behind him, Renly gathered the largest army in the war and marched slowly toward the capital, in no hurry, certain the crown was already his. Stannis, meanwhile, held nothing but the rock of Dragonstone and a few thousand men. He had the better claim and the weaker hand, and it was eating him alive. What Stannis did about it was the darkest turn the war had yet taken. On Dragonstone, he had fallen under the sway of a red priestess from the east, Melisandre, who saw things in her fires and spoke of a fiery god and a chosen champion. Whatever she truly was, she gave Stannis something no honest lord could give him. On the eve of the 2 brothers' armies meeting outside Storm's End, a shadow came in the night, a thing born of Melisandre's magic and Stannis' blood, and it killed Renly in his own tent, in the middle of his own guarded camp, with no wound that any man could explain. Renly died, and his enormous host was left leaderless overnight. Most of them, the Stormlanders and the Reach men both, simply changed sides. They flocked to Stannis, because Stannis was the last Baratheon left standing, and their king was dead. In a single night, the weakest of the claimants became the strongest. Stannis took Storm's End, folded Renly's soldiers and his fleet into his own, and turned his whole strength toward the true prize. King's Landing was defended by a boy king, a hated queen, and an army far away in the west. Stannis had ships and men and a burning certainty that the throne was his by every law of gods and men. He turned his fleet toward the mouth of the Blackwater rush and sailed for the capital, meaning to end the war in one stroke. Inside the city, the people who held it were not idle. Cersei's clever younger brother, Tyrion Lannister, had come to King's Landing as acting hand while his father fought the Northmen, and he had spent every week since preparing for exactly this. He knew he could not beat Stannis in a fair fight, so he set about making certain the fight would not be fair. He had a great chain forged, link by link, long enough to stretch across the whole mouth of the Blackwater, anchored in the stone of the shore and hidden beneath the water. A boom that could be raised to trap an entire fleet in the river once it had sailed in. He tripled the city watch, hired sellswords, called in what men the small houses of the Crownlands could give, the contingents of Rosby and Stokeworth, and lined the walls with scorpions and catapults. Wild clansmen from the mountains of the Vale harried Stannis's outriders, and beneath it all, in the guild hall of the pyromancers, Cersei set the alchemist to making wildfire in enormous quantity. The same green substance the Mad King had hidden under these very streets, poured now into thousands of clay jars. The whole defense rested on more than the chain and the fire, though. It rested on an army that was not yet there. Tywin Lannister was in the field to the west, and getting him back to the capital in time was the true problem. Robb Stark had understood this and raided deep into the Westerlands to draw Tywin away, and it had worked. Tywin had gone chasing the young wolf far from where he was needed. What no one had planned was the thing that saved King's Landing. Edmure Tully, meaning only to protect his own small folk, held the fords of the Red Fork against Tywin's crossing and turned him back again and again. He thought he was winning a small victory. In truth, he was delaying Tywin's march east by days he could not spare. Days that would decide the whole war, though no one on either side yet knew it. Stannis, for his part, had troubles of his own. His great fleet was slowed by foul weather in the narrow sea, and the delay nagged at him. When at last the wind allowed it, he gave command of the fleet to Sir Imry Florent, his wife's uncle, aboard the great war galley Fury. Stannis kept the bulk of his land army to come up the south bank of the river. It was a division of his strength, and it would matter. So the two forces bent toward each other, and the ground they were bending toward was not new. It was the mouth of the Blackwater rush, the same water where, 300 years before, Aegon the Conqueror had run his ships ashore with fewer than 1,600 men and begun the making of everything that followed. The throne forged from the swords of the Field of Fire now sat in a city on that river's bank, and the greatest battle of this whole long war was about to be fought at the very place it had all begun. And it would be decided, as every great battle of Westeros had been decided, before a single sword was drawn. In a chain hidden under the water, in a river turned to green fire, and in a Lannister army arriving at exactly the right moment. The first the city saw of Stannis was a forest of sails coming up the bay in the failing light. His fleet did not straggle in. It came on in good order. 10 long battle lines of some 20 ships each, warship behind warship, oars beating the water in time, banners of the fiery heart snapping above the masts. It was a great and terrible sight. Stannis had more ships than the defenders had by far, and he wanted the men on the walls to count them and lose heart. Command of that fleet belonged to Sir Imry, aboard the towering war galley Fury. He had numbers on his side, and numbers had always been enough for men who trusted them. So he did the thing that confident commanders do. He sent no scouts ahead. He did not slow to feel out the river's mouth or wonder why the towers on the shore looked freshly built. He formed his lines and drove straight into the Blackwater, meaning to smash whatever small fleet the boy king could muster and put his soldiers ashore beneath the walls before the night was old. Down in the van sailed an old smuggler turned lord, Davos Seaworth, a man who had learned the coasts of Westeros the hard way and knew when a stretch of water was wrong. Davos looked at the shore as they came on and saw things that had not been there before. New watchtowers stood on both banks of the river's mouth, squat and raw. And where the towers faced each other across the water, something ran down into the river and vanished. The ends of a great chain, though he could not yet know its full length or purpose. He felt the danger of it in his gut. But Imry commanded the fleet, not Davos, and the lines were already committed, pouring into the mouth of the Blackwater with the current and the tide carrying them in. The city met them with iron and fire. From the walls and the new towers, the defenders loosed everything they had. Scorpions threw their great bolts. Catapults flung stones that came down through decks and men alike. Pots of burning pitch arced out over the water and burst against hulls and sails. The lead ships of Stannis' fleet took the punishment and kept coming, because that was what the plan required, and the sheer weight of them began to tell. They drove the little defending fleet back up the river toward the city, ship grinding against ship, grapnels flying, men leaping from deck to deck with axes and swords. For a while, it looked exactly like the battle Imry had expected. A hard, close fight that numbers would win. That was precisely what Tyrion had counted on. He had never meant to win the fight in the river's mouth. He had meant to let it happen. High on the walls, he waited and watched the great galley Fury push deep into the channel, deeper and deeper, past the point where the Red Keep loomed over the water. The whole fleet followed her, line after line crowding into the river behind their flagship, exactly as he had hoped. Then he gave the signal, and down at the water's edge, a hard-bitten sellsword named Bronn put teams of oxen to their work. The great chain that had lain hidden beneath the surface began to rise, dripping, out of the black water. Link after enormous link hauled taut across the whole mouth of the Blackwater, from the tower on one bank to the tower on the other. Behind Stannis' fleet, the door of the trap swung shut. The ships that had sailed so boldly into the river now had a wall of iron across the only way out, and the tide and the current at their backs pinning them against it. Hundreds of warships, packed gunwale to gunwale in a channel with no room to turn and no way home. For a moment, none of them understood what had happened. And then Tyrion sprang the second half of the trap, the half that would be remembered for as long as men told stories of that river. Out in the crush of ships floated a small, unremarkable vessel called the Swordfish, an old galley with a long iron ram at her prow. She came on through the tangle and drove that ram deep into the side of a hulk that had been anchored in the channel, a ship that looked like any other, and was not. Her belly was packed with clay jars, and the jars were full of wildfire. The ram split her open, and the green substance the Mad King had once hoarded beneath these very streets spilled out across the water and found a flame. The river caught fire. It did not burn the way ordinary fires burn. Wildfire will burn on water, will cling to wood and flesh and stone and cannot be beaten out, and it burns a green so bright it hurts the eye. In a heartbeat, the surface of the Blackwater became a single sheet of jade flame, racing from ship to ship faster than men could run from it. The clay jars stacked aboard vessel after vessel took the fire and burst, and each burst through the flames farther. The great war galleys that had come up the river in such proud order now stood packed together in a lake of fire with nowhere to go. They could not flee downstream, for the chains sealed the mouth. They could not flee up, for the fireships and the current and their own crowded lines blocked the way. They could only burn. What followed was a slaughter by fire. Nearly every ship in both fleets was destroyed in that green inferno. Stannis' warships and the city's own defending vessels together, for Tyrion had spent his own fleet as readily as the enemy's to spring the trap. Thousands of men died in the water. Those who leapt overboard to escape the burning decks found the water itself alight around them, or drowned dragged down by their armor, or were pulled beneath by the current. The Fury herself, the mighty flagship, caught and burned with hundreds aboard her. The screaming carried all the way to the walls, and the men who watched from the battlements would remember the colour of that light for the rest of their lives. Davos Seaworth, who had seen the danger and been unable to stop it, was aboard one of the ships that the blast tore apart. His vessel was shattered under him, and he was flung into the river and swept away, downstream and out toward the bay, clinging to wreckage, carried alive out to sea while the water burned behind him. His sons, who had sailed in with him, were not so fortunate. The fire took them, as it took nearly everything that had entered the Blackwater that night. Some 30 or 40 of Stannis' galleys at the rear of his lines had not yet passed into the killing ground when the river erupted, and they were able to claw their way back and pull upstream out of the worst of it. And enough ships had reached the southern shore before the fire, or driven their bows onto the mud in the chaos, that perhaps 8 of them managed to land the soldiers they carried. Companies of Stannis' men waded ashore south of the city, and the Myrish sellswords among them, seeing the ruin of the fleet, broke and fled along the south bank, rather than march to their deaths. But thousands of fighting men did make it onto solid ground beneath the walls, wet and furious, and still very much a threat. For Stannis' navy, though, the night was already decided. Tyrion had done the one thing no attacker could plan for. He had taken the Blackwater rush itself, the same water Aegon the Conqueror had ridden ashore on 300 years before, and turned it into a weapon. He had made a wall of green fire out of a river, and behind it he had burned an entire fleet to ash in the space of a single hour. But burning a fleet is not the same as winning a war. The thousands of men who had reached the southern shore before the fire took the river did not turn back. They knew what had happened to the ships behind them, and it made them desperate rather than afraid. Stannis himself was on that south bank, and he drove his soldiers across the water on rafts and barges and the hulls of the ships that had run aground, ferrying them over in wave after wave to the walls of the city. The battle in the river was lost. The battle for King's Landing had only begun. Stannis' men came against the mud gate and the walls above the river in their hundreds and then their thousands. They dragged rams up from the water's edge and set ladders against the stone. The defenders on the battlements poured down arrows and stones and more of the burning pitch, but the attackers kept coming, because Stannis Baratheon did not know how to stop once he had begun. The gate shuddered under the rams. In places the ladders held long enough for men to reach the top of the wall, and the fighting spilled onto the battlements themselves. For all Tyrion's cleverness with the chain and the fire, the city was in real danger of being taken the old way, by weight of men climbing over its walls. The defense began to fray. Word came that the mud gate was near to breaking, and that Stannis' soldiers were massing in the ground beyond it, faster than the men on the wall could kill them. Something had to be done on the far side of the gate, out in the dark where the attackers gathered, or the city would fall. And in that moment the two men who might have led the defense both failed it in different ways. Sandor Clegane, the Hound, was the finest fighter in the city and the terror of the enemy, but the Hound could not master his own oldest fear. All his life he had been unable to bear the sight of fire, since the day his brother held his face to the flames as a child. Now the whole river was burning, the sky was green with it, and the heat and the light broke something in him. He had already cut his way through the enemy again and again that night, and he had reached the end of what he could give. He would not go back out into the fire. He walked off the battlements and out of the battle, and no command could turn him. That left the sortie to be led by another, and in the end it was led by the last man anyone would have chosen. Tyrion Lannister, small and half forgotten by the men he commanded, gathered what soldiers he could and led them out a postern gate himself, around behind Stannis' attackers where they crowded against the mud gate. It was a reckless, brilliant stroke. The attackers, intent on the wall in front of them, did not expect an armed force to come at their backs out of the darkness, and Tyrion's men fell on them and threw them into confusion. For a while, the little lord who had planned the whole defense fought in the thick of it with a borrowed axe, and held the enemy off the gate with his own body and the men who followed him. It nearly killed him. In the chaos of that fight, one of his own side turned on him, a treachery arranged from within the Red Keep, and a sword opened his face nearly in half. He went down in the mud among the dying, and by rights that should have been the end of him. Others fell there for good. Sir Jacelyn Bywater, the honest, iron-handed commander of the City Watch, was cut down when his own gold cloaks turned on him in the confusion of the fighting. The sortie had bought time, but it had cost the defenders dearly, and out beyond the walls, Stannis' host was still vast, still furious, and still coming. By every measure that mattered, King's Landing should have fallen that night. The fleet that was meant to defend it was ash. The Hound had abandoned the wall. The man who had held the defense together lay bleeding and senseless. Stannis had thousands of fighting men ashore and the gate nearly broken. And then, at the last hour, the thing happened that decides so many battles in Westeros. Help arrived from a direction no one was watching. Out of the night, striking Stannis' army in the rear, came a great host. Lord Tywin Lannister marched at its head with the full strength of the West, and beside him came Mace Tyrell, Lord of Highgarden, with the power of the Reach, and hard-fighting men like Randil Tarly and Sir Garland Tyrell. This was the army that had been away in the West, drawn off by Robb Stark's raids, and delayed for days at the fords of the Red Fork, where Edmure Tully had held them without ever knowing what his stand would prevent. That delay had nearly doomed the city. Instead, it brought Tywin to the field, at the one moment his arrival could win everything. The blow fell on Stannis' men from behind while they were still locked against the walls, and it broke them. But it was not only the weight of the fresh host that shattered Stannis' army. Much of that army had, until weeks before, belonged to Renly Baratheon, Stormlanders and Reach Knights who had followed the younger brother and gone over to the elder only after Renly died. Now they looked back and saw the banners of men they had marched beside under Renly, riding to the aid of King's Landing, and their will broke. They deserted Stannis by the hundreds, some throwing down their arms, some going over to the attackers outright. An army that fights for a claim it never loved does not stand long when the ground turns beneath it. Stannis Baratheon raged and cursed and would have fought on alone, but his lords dragged him from the field to save his life. His host dissolved. Thousands of his men were left behind on the north bank with no ships to carry them home, and they surrendered or died where they stood. The battle was over, and King Joffrey held his throne, though he had done nothing to earn it. When the sun rose, it lit a river choked with the black bones of sunken ships, the quays burned to the waterline, and the Blackwater still smoking. Tywin Lannister rode into the city as its saviour, and was named Hand of the King. The sellsword Bronn, who had raised the chain, was knighted for it, and the alliance sealed on that field, Lannister and Tyrell bound together, with Margaery Tyrell soon promised to Joffrey, would rule the Seven Kingdoms for years to come. Stannis had come to that river with the better claim and the stronger host, and he lost it all in a single night. He lost the same way the two kings had lost at the Field of Fire, and the same way Rhaegar had lost on the Trident. A single decisive advantage, arriving at exactly the right moment, a chain, a river of fire, and an army out of the dark, had decided everything. The same river that carried away the ruin of Stannis' fleet had carried something else, 3 centuries before, when Aegon Targaryen first beached his ships at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush. No one alive could have told you what that muddy shore would come to mean. But everything that followed, every throne won and lost, every host burned or drowned or broken in the dark, traces back to that landing and the 6 battles that grew from it. Look at them together, across the whole span of years, and a single shape emerges. It begins with fire. At the Field of Fire, Aegon and his sisters did not win, because they had more men. They had barely a tenth of what the 2 kings brought against them. They won because they had 3 dragons and a dry field, and the will to burn 4,000 men alive in an afternoon. From the swords of the dead they made a chair, and that chair, the Iron Throne, 1,000 blades melted and beaten together, became the prize that every battle after was fought to sit upon. Aegon did not just win a kingdom that day. He forged the very thing his heirs would kill each other for. And kill each other they did. The dragons that made the Targaryens unbeatable were turned, in time, on the family that rode them. In the Gullet, the waters between Dragonstone and Driftmark ran red as a foreign fleet fell upon a convoy of Targaryen children, and dragons burned 100 galleys to the waterline, but paid for it in the blood of a prince and a beast dragged down into the sea. Above the God's Eye, the greatest dragon ever to fly met another Targaryen in single combat in a gathering storm, and both riders and both dragons fell into the lake locked together, so that the fight ended in mutual annihilation, both riders and both beasts gone together. Vhagar had carried Visenya over the Field of Fire. Now Vhagar sank into the water with a sword driven through her rider's eye, and the last living link to the conquest was gone. This is the quiet truth that runs beneath the whole age of dragons. The beast that could not be beaten in open battle could still be lost. To a fleet, to a lake, to another dragon, and they could not be made again. every dragon that died in the dance was a dragon that would never be born. And so the family that had ruled from the backs of monsters slowly used up the very thing that had lifted them above other men. By the time the dance ended, nearly all the dragons were dead. The Targaryens kept the throne, but they kept it as men now, with steel and law and the memory of fire, and nothing more. So when the dynasty finally fell, it fell to a hammer. On the Trident, there was no dragon left to defend the last true Targaryen king in the making. Rhaegar rode to that ford with the larger army and the older name, and Robert Baratheon met him in the middle of the stream and crushed his chest with a single blow. The rubies scattered into the water and gave the ford its name, and the dynasty the Field of Fire had built ended in a river, under one stroke of a warhammer. The heirs of the conqueror had come all the way down to fighting like everyone else, and the moment they did, they could lose like everyone else. But a battle only decides who has lost the war. It does not always decide who wins the peace. King's Landing fell to a lie. Tywin Lannister rode to the gates swearing loyalty he did not feel, and a mad king opened them to the man who would sack his city. Beneath the throne of melted swords, children were murdered to buy the favor of the new king, and the peace that followed was built on that unanswered crime. Robert took the crown he never wanted, married a woman who never loved him, and let the wounds of the sack scar over without ever healing. Every fault line that would one day crack the realm apart was already there in the stone, on the very day he sat down. And crack it did, 16 years on, at the same river where all of it had begun. When 5 men reached for the throne at once, the greatest battle of that war was fought at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, the exact water where Aegon first landed his ships. Stannis Baratheon came with the better claim and the stronger host, and he lost it to a chain, a river of green fire, and an army arriving out of the dark. The river that had carried the swords of the Field of Fire downstream to become a throne now carried the burn bones of the ships that failed to take it. Set the 6 of them side by side, and the same lesson repeats until it cannot be ignored. Not one was won by a fair contest of numbers. The 2 kings had 5 times Aegon's men, and were burned where they stood. The Triarchy came to the Gullet with 100 ships, and left it choked with their wreckage. Rhaegar had the larger army on the Trident, and died in the stream. Aerys held the strongest walls in the realm, and lost them to an open gate. Stannis had the larger fleet and the larger host at the Blackwater, and lost both in a single night. Every one of these battles turned on an advantage the losers never saw coming. Dragonfire on a dry field, dragons at sea, a suicidal stroke in a storm, a hammer in a ford, a chain and a river of fire, and a host striking from behind at the perfect hour. That is how thrones are truly won in Westeros. By the side that brings a weapon, the other cannot answer, and the ground itself remembers all of it. The Blackwater Rush, where Aegon beached his ships, and where Stannis' navy burned, carrying away in its current both the swords that became a chair and the ships that could not reach it. The Gullet, where the narrow sea swallowed a prince and a dragon. The God's Eye, that dark lake beside the ruin of Harrenhal. The castle Aegon burned in the first days of the conquest, where the oldest dragon in the world sank forever. 3 waters, and between them they hold the whole story. The fire that raised the Targaryens, the fire that consumed them, and the men who came after to fight over what was left. In the end, the greatest battles of Westeros were never really about the men who died in them. The conscripts who burned on the Field of Fire, the sailors who drowned in the Gullet, the knights who fell on the Trident, the small folk butchered in the sack, the deserters left on the north bank of the Blackwater. They were never the point, they were the price. The point was always the same chair of 1,000 melted swords, sitting cold in a hall above the river, waiting for the next man desperate enough to reach for it. Aegon forged it from the weapons of the men he burned. Every king who followed paid for it in blood the winners would rather forget. And the dragons that made it possible were gone long before the fighting ended, burned away one by the very family that had ridden them to power. That is the true cost of the Iron Throne. It was bought with fire, and in the buying, the fire itself was spent.